slides, just to give you context. These are the slides from Scott Hunter. We won't waste a lot of time doing slides, but I'll just give you a little bit of context here before we start, and I'll skip past the marketing crap. And let's see if I can get Safia in here as well. Oh, and then we'll talk about the prompt. I see Stacy there. Hello, who likes my prompt. We can talk about that as well. And then when Safia gets in, if you can make her a presenter as well, Luke, that would be cool. Can you promote her? Safia. There she is. Give her the power. I think it's just right click.
All these technical issues just when you need.
I'm just going to go ahead and do it myself then.
Okay.
All right. So Safia, I made you a presenter. You can unmute yourself now and say hi.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Thanks for helping me out. I was trying to put together my pile of demos and stuff like that, and I was just like, I was going to try to do Safia's demo for her, and then I'm like, I'm just going to ask the expert to do it. So let me give you a couple of bits of context first. Again, put some stuff in the questions if you have in the chat, and then we'll have Safia do her demo, and then I'll let her go because she probably has better, more important things to do than hanging out with us today. All right, cool. So this is some slides from .NET Conf, just to give you a little bit of context. So .NET 6 and .NET in general, as you know, is trying to be unified. We're trying to make it so you can do .NET everywhere. If you actually want to see a cool talk, go check out my .NET Everywhere talk at .NET Conf. It's on YouTube, YouTube/DOTNET. It was called .NET Everywhere. And I show you that you can run it literally everywhere. I even got .NET running on my Remarkable, which is a Linux-based e-ink notebook. Does not run Android. And that, because it runs ARM, it'll work on that. And .NET even runs now on ARM 7 and up. So I got it running on a Raspberry Pi Zero W2 now, the little $15 Raspberry Pi. We run on that now. I've got it running on a microcontroller from Wilderness Labs, which is really cool. So, the goal is to run everywhere that you possibly can. And now that we've got that ARM support going back pretty far, that's pretty hot. It also runs now formally on the M1 chips from Apple. So that's cool. All of that sitting on top of common base libraries. So trying to make things a little simpler than they were with the whole .NET standard. Everything is on a common base library and a runtime, and everything sits on top of that, which means you can have even greater code reuse than before. Things are going well. Everything is awesome. These are kind of marketing numbers, but one of the things that's worth pointing out is that we've got almost 7,000 active community contributors. So a lot of people adding to .NET and making it awesomer. I actually went with John Galloway and we did a loop through all of the commits in .NET 6 and then pulled out faces. And we've got lots of people. These are all people who have done commits to .NET. So we put together a photo mosaic. It's pretty cool. One of the things that's interesting about .NET, and I actually recently just upgraded my podcast website and my home website to .NET 6, is you'll get perf improvements by simply upgrading. So if you have .NET 3.1 or you have .NET 5, just by upgrading, you're going to get perf benefits. So I went to my blog, and if you scroll to the very bottom of both my blog and my podcast, I actually have runtime detection of what version of .NET that I'm running on. And we also had this running in Azure on day one. Historically, we've kind of sucked where .NET would come out and then you'd wait 3 or 4 months for it to show up on Azure. But now we've got it dialed in where the day .NET comes out, it'll also run on Azure. So that's pretty cool. We've seen some really cool perf benefits just by upgrading to .NET 6. Entity Framework is almost double the speed. And a bunch of internal Microsoft websites have recently started upgrading as well, which is cool, including like Azure AD and those login things. And you can see some cool graphs and stuff on the .NET blog where they talk about the benefits, and you can see when they changed it from .NET 5 to 6, it just goes whoop, and then you just get 30% more, benefits. And if you want to learn about the internal goo about that, Stephen Tobe is a lovely fella who does a performance blog every .NET release, and there it is right here. This thing is nuts. This is his like annual monster post about perf, and he's been doing this since .NET Core 2, and now that it's just called .NET, because the number 6 is greater than the number 4.8, so now we just call it .NET. He's got almost 550 PRs that are all performance-based. So he's made this huge table of contents about all the different things that he and the team have done to make things faster. So if you're interested in like the low-level stuff, whether it be like, hey, what'd they do for the jitter and to make things faster? This is definitely, look at the scroll bar here. This is definitely something that is, I think, probably about 40 pages long. And you can see some of the crazy stuff. Performance always makes me feel some kind of way, because it's like, does that mean that this sucked 300 times more than this? Like, what do you do with that information? Like, did we just really suck? But then you realize that .NET Framework was really tied to Windows, and processors change, processor instructions change. This isn't saying just that .NET 6 is faster, but the compiler is smarter, the jitter is smarter, the GC is smarter. There's a whole series of things that are added to make stuff better. And then there's also this new thing called, I think it's called Pog, Progressive Optimization. Do you remember the name of that, Sophia? It's turned off by default, but it gets you another 4 or 5. I think Fowler was talking about it, and it's off by default, but they're going to turn it on in the next version. Shoot. Oh yeah, there's some of the perf stuff. Oh man, I can't remember the name of that. I've got this term POG in my head, and I can't remember what it was. I'll ask PGO. There we go. Thanks. Check this out. There we go. Profile guided optimization. So this is something that's being invested in .NET 6 that's really significant, but it's off by default. And the problem that it's solving is it's like it's running the code, seeing that it can make an improvement even though it's actively running it. So it's almost like tuning your engine while you're driving the car, and then looking at the optimizations they could potentially do. So by turning it on, you can get 5-6% more perf. So there's a whole discussion here about what's involved in building that kind of stuff. And right now there's an environment variable that you have to turn on, .NET PGO environment variable. But in .NET 7, that'll be turned on by default. I'm going to browser here. Sorry. There we go, CLI environment variable. No, that's wrong. Okay, here we go, profile guided optimizations. Runtime tiered compilation. Profile guided optimization, there it is. .NET tiered PGO. So if you turn that environment variable on, it gets enabled by default, and they're kind of testing it right now. And then in the future, that's going to be on by default. So that's a really cool thing. All of this just means perf is just bananas right now. So, just in any framework, it's almost double. Query performance, 36% better. Also worth reminding ourselves, a lot of people don't remember that C# itself is versioned. So C# 10 is available in .NET 6, and I think Sophia's got an example of some of the cool stuff, like top-level programs, new Lambda features, and things like that, so we'll get to her really quickly. C# 10 and F# 6 available in .NET 6. What's significant, though, is that when I went and upgraded my blog just a couple of days ago, all of these things are optional. So I think I wrote a blog post about how easy it was to upgrade. If I go to my blog here and say, here we go, let's upgrade my main site and my podcast. Primarily, I just went and made a couple of changes to like a Docker file, building on 6 instead of 5. And then I made a change in my target. Oops, that was weird. change in the target framework of my CS proj. So a lot of people online, you may be reading things about top-level programs and new Lambda features, and people may be getting like, why are you moving my cheese? Why is everyone at Microsoft changing stuff? Literally all this stuff is optional. It is not a big deal. So my app compiled. Even the new minimal APIs and the minimal startup.cs, totally optional. Don't have to do it if you don't want to do it. Okay. Let's switch out of here. We'll come back because I want to let Sophia go. I'm going to talk about simplified development in the CLI as well as the hot reload. But I think Sophia's demo is actually a good place to start. So why don't you share your screen, Sophia? Let's talk about top-level programs and look at the minimal API, and she's got a hosted client on top of it.
Yeah, cool. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show you some of what we've been working on with minimal APIs in .NET 6. Awesome.
And I'm going to ask questions too, if that's okay too.
Yes. Everyone can see my screen, correct?
Yep, and you're on a Mac. Scandalous. You work for the company. Oh my goodness.
Trust me, I get grief about it every day. I'm kidding, obviously. Cool. So what I've got on my screen here is actually a minimal app that we wrote as a demo app for .NET Conf last year. One of the things that you'll notice about this is that this app is leveraging top-level programs. So there's no main method, no program class file here in my application or my source code. All of the logic that I have is just directly at the top level of the source statement. So, you get rid of all that nesting, you get rid of all that extra cruft that you don't really need, and you're able to just get down into the business logic of your application.
What namespace is this in though?
This namespace that my application is in is actually under the namespace for my project. So it's going to be Contoso Construction Server namespace.
Okay. So that's it. So it's all implicit.
Yes.
Okay.
So top level programs are a new feature in C# 10. Those are near and dear to me because I just think they make things so much easier, especially when you're trying to test out stuff really quickly. Also support for implicit using. So one of the things you'll notice here is I've only really got 2 using statements in my program CS here, but I'm actually using a lot of different APIs and namespaces. The reason I can get away with only having 2 namespaces or 2 using statements in my file is because some of the default or more common namespaces like system threading tasks are included by default using implicit usings in my project. So it's just a few more lines of code that I don't have to worry about adding to my application. So that's kind of one of the big themes with minimal and all of the C# effort is let's get rid of all of the stuff that's not really necessary and help you get down to the business logic of your application. On the topic of business logic, I want to show you what it actually looks like to implement a web API into using minimal APIs. So I've got some of what you might expect to see in my program CS file. A lot of what you would have previously done in the startup class can now be done directly in your program CS file. You'll notice here I'm doing service registration by invoking all of the extension methods that I need directly on builder services. So there's no longer a configure services method that you have to modify. So all of that is kind of top level in my program CS file here. The fun part is down at my method definitions. So I've got a couple of different endpoints defined in my application. This is an application that allows users to kind of manage job sites for a construction company. So I've got a get endpoint that's going to get a list of jobs. And you can see here it's defined using this map get method. And the way I invoke this method is I provide a path that the user is going to send the request to, and then a lambda that implements the actual business logic or core logic of my API.
Quick question from the chat, just for context. Yeah. Could you expand the server folder? So this program.cs is in the server folder, correct?
Yep.
And we're looking at a solution with 3 projects, client, server, and shared, or 3 separate CS projects, right?
Yes, cool.
Okay.
Question. So yeah, I hope I'm zoomed in. I'm not just.
Yep, we can see server. There you go. So, yep, so program.cs here, this is the API on the back end that we're looking at.
Correct.
Okay.
This is my project file. I've got some dependencies that I've included here for EF and Azure SQL and all of that fun stuff. And then I've also got some dependencies for Swagger integration.
And then line 5 there, implicit usings enable.
Yes, that's the magic that allows me to only have 2 using statements in my program CS file. Pretty nifty. Cool. So I was sharing a little bit about, this business logic is implemented in Lambdas in our API. One of the cool things, again, that we collaborated with the language team on for C#10 is improvements to Lambdas in C#10. So one of the features that was shipped out is support for attributes on Lambdas. So one of the things that you previously couldn't do, for example, if I wanted to make this get endpoint authorized, I wouldn't be able to apply an authorize attribute like so. Squiggly because my namespace is not in there, but that's now supported in C#10. It's supported for both the Lambda and parameters on the Lambda as well. Other improvements included the ability to define like an explicit return type for a Lambda. So all sorts of goodness that we were able to collaborate with the C# team on. And we're actually going to keep doing more of that for .NET 7 and future versions of C#. So I think it's always really fun when we're building stuff out, we can collaborate across teams to make sure it's like spot on.
What do you say if someone says like this looks like PHP or active server pages, or like what happens if this turns into a big pile and I want to have more classes and stuff, and they think that this is messy if it gets too complicated?
Great question. So for the purposes of this demo, I've got everything written in one file. That is not at all a requirement for this. You are welcome to consider whatever kind of code structure or scaffolding that you want to set up for your particular application. So one of the things that we did in our .NET Conf demo, for example, is we moved all of the business logic associated with interacting with the database into a job service, and we injected that service into our DI and then used that in our program CS file. So you are free to kind of imagine and think about whatever structure you want. Obviously, for certain applications, you're not going to have everything in a program CS file because your teammates will probably hate you very quickly. But yes, you have tons of flexibility with how you want to structure your code.
Cool, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so we've got kind of top level programs. We've covered Lambdas. One of the other things that you might notice as you look at the endpoints here is that I'm passing things in like the job site DB, which is my database service, into my Lambda. And if I scroll down here a little bit to my map post endpoint, I'm also taking in a job parameter, which is one of the DTOs in my application as a parameter to the Lambda. So one of the things that's really neat about minimal APIs is it has support for implicit parameter resolution. And what that essentially means is if we take a look at one of your map get definitions, let's say that I'm looking at this map get for a job by its ID, we'll kind of try and infer, hey, you want to have a ID parameter for this particular endpoint. It looks like we might be able to resolve this from this route parameter ID that you have defined, or perhaps a query parameter if it's not there. And if you have something like a job site DB, we'll say, hey, it looks like you've got a service called job site DB registered. So we'll infer and use that as the DTO, or is the object that's passed into the parameter. This is essentially the equivalent of doing this from service. And then I think this would be from route. So previously where you might have had to explicitly define what sources your parameters are being pulled from, we'll kind of do that work for you and pull them in. Of course, you are welcome to continue to explicitly outline where you want certain things from.
Okay, so that means that this was decorative attributes that we kind of had to like litter our entire thing with. Now we do smart defaults, and if you don't like them, you can override them. But, yes, but now there's just one less thing to type.
Yes, and there's particular kind of rules of precedence that apply to which ones are kind of populated. So for example, things like HTTP context and a user claim are kind of special types that will be processed independently. For things like services and then JSON bodies, there's also a hierarchy to those. And one of the actually fun things that we spent a lot of time towards the end of .NET 6 thinking about is like making the errors really nice when you do something wrong or when something goes awry with inferred parameters in .NET 6. So I wish I could demo it now, but generally if something goes wrong where, you know, you pass in a type and it should have been resolved from the body, but it tries to read it as a service, you'll get a really nice error message that says, hey, we couldn't infer this correctly. Consider adding an attribute, or maybe just fixing, making sure you have the service registered or the DTO defined and what have you.
And a question in the chat here, and I think I know the answer, like the order of these don't matter. It's by name, and this is using dependency injection, and it's got a half dozen places to look for stuff. It can look in the route, it can look in the services list, and you know that's effectively a constructor, and dependency injection is making sure that it can resolve the type and the name of all the things that it needs, right?
Correct. Order does not matter. So here, if I had job site DB first and int ID second, like my endpoint would still function the same.
All right, cool.
Cool. Other things we worked on, actually, this is near and dear to my heart because it's kind of an area that I have picked up as my focus of sorts, which is Open API integration. Open API is essentially a schema that allows you to document or describe APIs written in any kind of platform. So if you've got something written in Node, you can write out its definition or description into a standardized convention and share it and all sorts of helpful stuff. Documenting APIs is good. Future selves will thank you for that effort. And we've kind of focused a ton on this. It was really great because I feel like community engagement in this particular area was really high. We had some folks in the community who were like testing out different things and contributing PRs. We collaborated with the folks on Swashbuckle and NSWAG to make sure that the integration was complete for minimal APIs. An open API plus Swashbuckle/NSWAG. So it was I thought it was a really fun kumbaya moment where we all kind of got to work together on this feature. What that essentially.
Sorry, can you explain the difference between lines 56 and 57 and what's implicitly expressed in 53 and 54? Because the results of OK and not found, 200 and 404 are implied, but 56 and 57 call it out explicitly for Open API. Is that correct?
Yes. I don't believe we support resolving the implied type yet for all things. Don't quote me on that. Mm-hmm. That's something we're going to be improving for .NET 7 is the ability for, if we see a API definition like so, we'll kind of automatically resolve what the inputs are, the response types, and you don't have to write as much annotation. We'll just figure it out for you. The proposal at the moment is to do that with a code fix where we'll kind of analyze your code, say, hey, it looks like you're returning these types of results and taking these types of inputs. Here's the annotations you should produce.
Gotcha. Because I can see that 58 and 59 are something that I would need to express. Like you can't infer that. But it kind of struck me that the other two could, while valuable, could be inferred by looking at the code path.
Believe it or not, the with name, we actually did take a stab at trying to infer that, and that was one of the collaborations we had with the C# team. So one of the things about top-level programs is that every method defined in a top-level program is a static method. And static methods, when they're generated by the compiler, have like a generated type name. So if I had a method, this is a total segue, but we're having fun. So let's say I had a method like getFoo. And it was like bar. When the compiler generates the definition for this method, it's going to be something like getFoo, nonsensical characters, some sort of specific generated type name that the compiler uses. And one of the things that we were trying to work with the compiler team on is, this is at reflection. This is using reflection. Given this kind of generated type name that's nonsensical, that there's no standard or agreement for, could we parse it and from the generated type name get the original method definition? And we actually shipped that in .NET 6 RC1. And then it was really nice. People used it and they were like, oh, cool. This thing will just kind of figure out my method name automatically and set it for me, and I don't have to do this with name shenanigans. And then we realized that there's a lot of edge cases when you rely on what is essentially a non-public, non-guaranteed API, and we had to pull it out. But yes, I think it's funny that of all of the extension methods used here, the one that we took a stab at making implicit or automatic was the with name one. But some improvements to be made on that.
Would with name be useful if you had overrides of like you're trying to project multiple functions into one named OpenID? If you could have, you have multiple get jobs that are n number of map gets?
Yeah, so with names map to operation IDs in the Open API schema, and generally the expectation is that those are unique per endpoint. So if you had multiple get jobs, maybe you had one that was like getting it by an ID or getting it by a name or a order date or some whatever heuristic was your endpoint was using, those would all have unique names, unique operation IDs, unique endpoints. So this is like a unique identifier. What you're referring to, I think, is the ability to cluster certain endpoints under a particular category. And that's where with tags comes in. So I've got with tags here, and I've got it in quite a few of my endpoints. I'm saying this is a getter, this is a getter, there's another one somewhere that's a getter. But with tags is kind of how I categorize endpoints into particular groups in my app. So
cool.
This all looks fun and dandy. I want to show you what it actually looks like functionally by popping into my Swagger UI here. So once you've annotated your API, this is what you get on the on the client UI for Swagger. So you can see here, I've got my categorizations, my getters, and my creators. If I expand my post jobs endpoint, you'll see that I've got the request body defined with the particular keys that exist in the DTO. So I've got my ID, my latitude, longitude, and my name, and then a description of what I expect this object to return. And if we pop into get jobs by ID, you remember earlier it had two produces to communicate that it could return a successful payload if it found an object, or it could return a 404. Well, that's communicated in my UI here.
Yeah, this is really cool because these are like, you can call these, right? This is like Postman. Yeah, there you go. So you can just run that thing.
Execute it. I'm going to do this live. I hope it works. Cool. Yeah, so I just hit execute. It sent the request to my jobs endpoint, and here I've got a JSON response containing all of my data. So you can play around and interact with your APIs through this experience once you've annotated them. Or you could be an overachiever and you can build a Blazor WebAssembly UI that hooks up to your application. So this is actually what I've done here. If you're not familiar with Blazor WebAssembly, you can have a Blazor WebAssembly client UI that is hosted and served by a backend ASP.NET server. So I can actually have my minimal API running on the same server that is hosting my Blazor client, and that's what I've done here. So if I go to the same port that my API server is running on, 6543, but I visit the index page, I get this fun little UI that I've built that shows all of the job sites in my database on a map. And I can actually interact from my Blazor client with my minimal API. So one of the things I have built here is if I click on an endpoint, I clicked in the middle of the ocean. Let's not do that. I will not send my workers out there. If we click on a job site, we can go ahead and give it a name. Let's say Foobar Baz, because I'm a very creative developer. And what I've done here is I've sent a post request to my back end to say, hey, at this particular latitude and longitude, create this new location. And if I refresh, oh my gosh, are we really dealing with this? Do I have to debug it live? So one of the things I've noticed is that there's a weird bug. It's not a API bug because I can get the responses here. It's kind of a bug with my map UI. Wow, that's embarrassing. A live demo had to fail at some point, didn't it?
Well, keep in mind that it's embarrassing that I couldn't get this running on my local machine, because on my machine, like my Google Maps says like development mode, unlicensed key, and I had all kinds of odd stuff. So you're helping me out by getting it mostly working.
Yeah. So actually, to show you that it was
Dustin in the chat says they saw the log, so they believe you.
Yeah, you've seen me. We're dealing with a Phantom bug here. But if I go ahead and again, I'm using the Swagger UI and I'm sending a request. I'll see here I've got my Foobar Baz that I've just added. So we know it for sure works. It's just my little map UI is not being nice to me. But yeah, that was kind of a whirlwind tour of what we've done with minimal APIs in .NET 6. I think as someone who's been working on this for the past couple of months, one of the coolest things has been collaborating with people in the community via all our open API stuff, interacting with people who've built samples and tried out things around like integration testing and improving it. And then like the internal collaborations we've had with the C# team where we're like, hey, we have this vision of what we want to do to make this experience really cool. Can you help us do that? So it's always really fun when you can work with people like that and ship a really fun experience at the end. And we're not done because software is never done. We've got more stuff in store for .NET 7. So if this is intriguing to you, do try it out. Share your feedback with us and let us know how we can make it better for .NET 7.
Really briefly, can you show the caller? Where do you actually call the API on the client side? Because this is Blazor on the client side.
Yeah, so this is Blazor on the client side. So here I've got my little Blazor app. This is a standard Blazor app similar to what you would get if you did .NET New Blazor WASM on the template. I'm going to pop into my index Razor file. So one of the things that Razor will do is you can inject an HTTP client or have a HTTP client server that you can resolve in your Razor page, and then you can use that HTTP client to send out post requests or get requests to your API. So I'm using that strategy to interact with mine.
It's just one line.
It's just one line. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. And then scroll up because you have a third-party Google Maps thing that you were complaining about. Maybe your Google Maps wasn't working. This RADs in Google Map. Like I was expecting to see an iframe and a bunch of markup and all that, but that's being hidden by this RADs in Google Map laser control.
Yeah. So this was pretty nifty. I wasn't going to go in and do all of the craziness with like JavaScript and whatnot to hook it up into my Blazor app. So you just leverage the open source ecosystem. So RADZen has a ton of great components for Blazor. And I pulled out this Google Map one. And again, this entire thing is maybe like, 49 lines of code, give or take, for all the white space and cruft. You understood JavaScript before you came to work here. Did you ever get, when I'm in Blazor, sometimes I get confused about like what's on the server and what's on the client and like what's JavaScript and what's not. Do you ever get confused? And like you had that JS runtime briefly. Could you mention that line 2 and how you use that? Yeah, great question. So since I'm on Blazor WebAssembly, everything is technically running on the client, meaning my browser. My server, my minimal API server, is running on the server, which is my local computer. But my Blazor WASM client is running entirely in the browser on WebAssembly. And this JS runtime is essentially a Blazor construct for calling out to JavaScript APIs when needed. And I'm using this to fill a gap in my on-map click handler here that basically uses the prompt JavaScript call to pop out that, hey, what's your job site name UI, and pull the data from that. So we use JS runtime often in Blazor if you want to call out to a JavaScript API for a particular reason from .NET. It's part of a native JavaScript prompt that popped up. Yes, so it's part of the JavaScript/.NET interop capabilities that come with Blazor WebAssembly. And then Dustin is confused about the console app. You have 2 console apps here, and they're running on different ports. We both on 5,000. Who's serving the API and who's serving the actual HTML page here? Great question. That's a great observation. So I've actually only got one app running, and that is my server application. However, my service application is hosting my Blazor WebAssembly client. So you can see here, I didn't show this explicitly, but we'll talk about it now. I've got this use Blazor framework files middleware that I'm registering. And then if we scroll up to the top, I am also adding support for Razor pages and controllers with views, which are all required for being able to serve the Blazor WebAssembly client. And essentially what this will do, when you build a Blazor application, it gets compiled down to a bunch of DLLs, a .NET WASM runtime, and then some small kind of some small HTML, CSS, JavaScript files that are included in your application. So my application server is actually going to be serving the static index.html file that hosts my Blazor application from the server. So it's all one thing that is running, but my server is hosting my client. And this is a similar.
Is that like a new thing? Like, this is unusual. Like, naively, I would have expected, when I was trying to set this up on my local machine, I went into the solution, I right-clicked, and I said select multiple startups, which seemed intuitive to me. Like, I would select multiple startup projects, and I figured I would fire up each of them together, and then I'd have to figure out which localhost port number I'm supposed to think on. And I couldn't find anywhere in here where, like, where do you know to call, what to call back to? And it was only when I figured out that the server was hosting the client. Like, is that just a convenience thing, or is that required?
So there's two different modes for running a Blazor WebAssembly application. One of them is called the Standalone Mode, and that is when you are trying to build a Blazor WebAssembly client without a backend server. Now, in that case, what you would do is you would run your client project and you would have your server application somewhere else. And in that scenario, you're running two different projects or applications. The model that I'm using is a hosted Blazor WebAssembly application, and that's where you have one solution with a server project that hosts your Blazor WebAssembly client that is hosted. It's not standalone. So that's kind of the distinction between determining whether or not you're running two console apps or one is, are you building a standalone Blazor WebAssembly client, or is it a hosted client?
And if you were trying to make this thing scale and be more than a sample, like, would this, if you were going to run this for 1 million people, would you, I think you'd want to have like the server part, you know, live in a container or live in n number of containers or in Kubernetes, and then you might have the client be a static web app or something. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's more about choice and convenience in this case here, like, but they are married at this point now, so they have to be together all the time.
Yep, they're married via this mapping, which basically says that the server has the ability to serve the static assets in Blazor framework files that are needed to host my client app.
Okay, cool. And then last question before I let you go. How did the Google Map package get in there? You didn't inject it, you just used it because it was referenced somewhere?
Yep, so I have a package reference to rads and Blazor in my project file here. Very nifty. And then Razor has this concept of an imports file. Funny story. So this, if you've worked with a Blazor application before, you might have seen this imports.razor file. And this is kind of the precursor, or I guess the grandpa of sorts, of implicit usings. Because with this imports file, you have all of the using statements that you want to be registered for all of the Razor pages in your application. So here I've added my rads and Blazor usings, and so those are automatically included in the Razor file. But yeah, imports.razor is kind of like the implicit usings of the Razor world.
Cool. And just so that people understand that, like, it's all about choice, I think it is worth pointing out that even though this is a really cool example of a Blazor client talking to a minimal API, the client could be fully static and JavaScript and React or Redux or whatever, right? Like, there's nothing about minimal APIs or web APIs that requires you to use Blazor on the client. It's just that you like to use Blazor.
Yes, and one of the cool things is, you know, I have this shared project here. If I'm using Blazor, I have my jobs DTO that I can actually use between my client and my server. So that ability to take advantage of the code sharing between the two is really great. But yeah, we've seen samples where you can have an API or in minimal APIs, and then your client is in React or Vue or Angular or your preferred front-end client of choice.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for getting this to work on your machine, because my machine is all buggered up right now. But yeah, you're a star. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right, you're welcome to hang out, and I'm going to talk about hot reload and some stuff. But follow Safia on Twitter. She's at Captain Safia. Apparently not a captain though, which was a new information I did not have. Safia, and she's a senior engineer on the .NET team, and this is just one of the awesome things that she works on. But thank you so much for helping out. Thank you, Captain. Say the people in the chat.
Thanks.
All right, awesome. And if you want to see an extended version of that with a lot more detail, Safia did a talk at .NET Conf that was pretty cool. So So one example I want to give here at the command line and I'm in Windows Terminal. If you're not using Windows Terminal, get on board, my friends, because it's the bomb. You'll notice that in my Windows Terminal here, I've got regular Windows Command Shell. I've got the current PowerShell. I've got Windows PowerShell rather. I've got the old DOS, but not really DOS. I've got multiple versions of Linux running here, but I'm running PowerShell. And then this thing here, because who doesn't want like an actual human heart in their prompt? This is called Oh My Posh. Oh My Posh. And this is just a prompt. It's totally optional. You can use whatever makes you happy. But I kind of found that this prompt was kind of harshing my mellow, and I wanted to have a cooler prompt. And what's nice about this is I've got the ability now with a bunch of optimizations that I've added, and you can see my blog. You notice how I start typing and I get, look at that, I get an actual autocomplete here. So I can go to specific, locations. And when I do that, so here I just jumped over to my websites folder. I've got the current version of .NET that is active in this folder. Now that can be Node or Rust or whatever you're doing. So that's totally not specific to Oh My Posh, because each segment of Oh My Posh can be set. And this human heart right here is actually telling you if I type something that the last command was an error level 1. And that's why that shows up red right there. Okay. And here we can see that Hanselman core is .NET 6. And if I go up to like the blog, it'll probably say, yeah, so this is not using a version of .NET that I have installed. I think it's .NET 3. And if I go back over to Hansel Minutes, which actually is up here, that's version 6 as well. So I'm going to go to GitHub hot reload, which is now currently empty. Okay, I'm going to make 2 examples. I'm going to call it Net 5 Web, and I'll make a Net 6 Web. All right, so I've got 2 folders now here, 5 and 6, and I'm going to type .NET --info, which is going to show me the versions of .NET that I have installed, and I'm going to grab this SDK here, this 5.0 right there, and I just put that in the clipboard. And then I'm going to go into the Net 5 Web folder, which is empty right now, and I'm going to type .NET new global JSON. It's going to make a JSON file, and I'm going to type Notepad 2 because it's one better than Notepad. And I'm going to open that up. Oh, denied. Did I not put that in the path? Scandalous. And this machine I just built from scratch a couple of days ago. So if things are not working, it's because I forgot to add stuff to my path. There we go. And now I'm going to take that version of the SDK. I'm going to change it to 5. Okay. The only thing in this folder is that. Now I hit dir, you can see global.json is right here, and this knows that we are using .NET 5. Okay. Now if I go push D because I'm old, and then go back up to Net 6, we see that there's nothing there. I could say .NET new Razor or .NET new Web in this folder here. Make an empty website. You can see that that's .NET 6. If I type pop D to go back, that's 5. Okay, so I have 2 folders right now, 5 and 6. Savvy? Savvy. Cool. So .NET new web app. Cool. .NET run. This is our 5.0 application. Pause for effect. This is still complete compile. It's going to load it up on localhost 5001. Notice that when I hover over that in Windows Terminal, which if you're not using it, again, this is the day that you switch to Windows Terminal. See how it's actually underlined? I can click on it and it will launch my browser, which is the hotness. Okay. Now I'm going to go back here and I'm going to actually delete this folder because I want a more complicated example. That example is too simple. So I'm going to delete everything but the global.json. And I'm going to try, I think it's .NET new Razor. I want Razor pages. That was an empty one. There we go. Now I've got pages. .NET run. Now I'm doing this at the command line. I could do it in Visual Studio. I can do it in Visual Studio Code, but I like to drive stick shift sometimes because it teaches you about what Visual Studio is doing for you. Sometimes people complain when I do this kind of stuff because they're saying, what happened to Visual Studio? What happened to my GUI? Da, 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 da. Yeah, I like to drive stick because now you know how the engine, you kind of have to build your own car once, and then you can go and drive Uber and drive a Tesla or whatever makes you happy. Okay, so here, I'm going to go ahead and put that off to the side, and then we'll put this off to the side. And if I want to open another folder here, let's go and run we'll run Visual Studio Code. Actually, no, let's not run Visual Studio Code. Let's be sassy and let's open up another split screen here. Another reason that you should use Windows Terminal. And let's go into this Net5 web and let's use Notepad again. And we'll open up pages index.cshtml. So here's my Razor page. Again, this is Razor, not Blazor. See where it says welcome here. Now, if I go back where it said .NET Run and I get rid of that, I'm just going to say .NET Watch Run instead of .NET Run. It's going to watch the files that are the source code for this thing. Okay, and then in Notepad, I'm just going to make a change here where it says welcome. And save. You'll see it said file changed, and then it rebuilt the whole thing. And then it hit refresh. So you saw that refresh moment there. Hey, y'all. Save, build 1, 1000, 2, 1000, 3, 1000, and then a refresh. So that was cool, but it wasn't exactly, hot, if you know what I'm saying. It was like it saw the change, but it saved me some time because ordinarily I would be Control-C and hit build and then run, and then it becomes kind of ceremonial and annoying. So let's go back up to the .NET 6 location. I think that I should have actually done a .NET new Razor here. So let's go there, and I'm going to torch this again and make a web app because this one's too simple. Okay, so .NET new Razor. Cool. .NET Watch. In this case, the run is implied. Yes, Piers called it lukewarm reload in .NET 5. That's exactly. It's tepid reload, not hot. All right. So here we got this one started up. Now let's go into .NET 6. Open that up. We got, oops, that's y'all. There we go. See that? Hot reload of changes. It actually pushed it in. Boom. Isn't that cool? Now, if you right click in here and you say view source, see a script at the bottom there that's allowing that to happen. And what's cool about this is that not only are we hot reloading in .NET 6 the code, we're also hot reloading HTML and CSS, and we added hot reload to C++. So it's the .NET 6 kind of Visual Studio 2022 release, excuse me, is basically hot reloading all the things. So being able to just go and make changes directly into CSS and into Razor is pretty cool. Now, if we go a little deeper and we do like an actual CS file, so this, I was showing you an HTML Razor page changing. Let's look at this logger, and I'm doing it in Notepad to show you that it's not married to Visual Studio. You may have heard there was a bit of a scandal, but this works everywhere, and that's why I'm doing it in Notepad. So here I'm making a change to the code behind inside of Notepad. And I think it was log, I think it's log critical. So I'm using the injected logger here. This is just coming in with dependency injection, and I'm just saying, oh my goodness, there's an error. And I'll just hit save. Okay, so log crit doesn't exist, and you see that it immediately got an error. And then I just changed it to log critical and I hit save. And look, the web page fixed itself. Isn't that cool? And there's the critical error at the bottom right there. So that is like the hotness. It's really, really cool. And it really improves that, what's called that developer's inner loop, which is all of that ceremony that we find ourselves doing multiple times. It's definitely changed the way that I do stuff. Now, the way that it's doing this, of course, is it's rewriting by using Roslyn, and it's compiling that one function, and then it's keeping extra space in the stack so that it can swap out one function for another. Now, it doesn't work with the main. So if you were trying to go into like program.cs and change the main, question here from someone marked as external, what are examples where it won't work? If the main's already run, public static void main, you can't change it. You'd have to restart the entire application. It's too late. It's already happened, right? It's the entry point. So you can't use hot reload on an entry point. And if you go to my YouTube, I have an extended example of this demo where I actually have to make an instance variable and make a change to that, because something that's static, that was the entry point of the entire application, it's too late, you can't use that. Additionally, if you changed like 50, 60, 70% of the code, that's gone from being a minor change to being something that would cause a reset, because you've overflowed the amount of space that we have to swap in a new compiled function. Yeah, great example. Configure services and configure, that's a big thing, right? If you change your, to use an old example, if you change your auto exec bat or your config sys, you're probably going to have to reboot to see that to actually change. Just like changing your path or your environment variable, you got to close your prompt and open it up again. That's different than changing the current environment. So statics and things like that are definitely things that you're going to have to change. But the ability to change HTML, CSS, and code behinds has meant that I can avoid a lot of ceremony and a lot of back and forth. And this kind of experience, this left and right, where I have like my logging and then my actual application, have worked out really nicely. Now, this is built into Visual Studio. So if we open up VS, I think they put it, yeah, here we go. So this is my podcast. Let's go ahead and run my podcast app real quick. Do I have anything running right now? I don't think so. We'll find out if I'm reusing a port. You see there's this button right here. It says hot reload on file save. You can make changes, and in Visual Studio, without actually even saving, you can push hot reload with this little hot button here, and that will push the changes back into the app without even saving the file. Khalifa is asking if there's any inconvenience doing hot reload. Not really. Like it just kind of is awesome all the time. I can't think of any examples where it's inconvenient. The deal is that if it can't do it, then you just do what you did before. There's really no inconvenience. Another thing that you can do, if we go back over here into like Net 6, and I do a .NET watch, I probably need to stop this one because I'm on the same port. There we go. You see how it says it? Where is it? Here you go. Control R to restart. Right? So in that case, I can just hit Control R and it'll go and build again. So Control R is a refresh in a browser. At the command line, it'll just refresh and start your microservice again. Tony's asking, with the hot reload button, when you didn't save, does it just put the changes in RAM? Yeah, because Roslyn and the C# compiler can see the text, it just compiles what's currently in the buffer and then takes that in memory and pushes it into your running application. The only difference is it never touched the disk. So it's just, where does it get the source from, the disk or from in memory? Oh, actually, remember how I was worried that it was going to have a problem with port 5000 and port 5001? Now it'll pick a range. If you don't specify 5000, 5001, .NET 6 will pick a range. So if you have lots of different apps running side by side like I do, you don't have that issue anymore. So I actually kind of forgot that, and it's cool to be reminded that it's not complaining about these things. I've been having issues lately because the Hanselman's website is actually an installable progressive web app, and it has some stuff that you can go and pin this app. And as such, it goes and enables the application storage section of your browser, and it goes and sets up a service worker. And as such, I had to keep turning it off because I have 2 different apps that run on port 5000. That problem goes away in .NET 6, which is cool. And then somebody brought up an example that I wanted to go and put up in the chat about the progressive web app. When I mentioned that Azure Active Directory's gateway moved over to .NET 6, Azure Active Directory has a gateway in 54 data centers, and they do 185 billion requests every day. And they've been running on .NET 6 since September. So .NET 6 came out a week ago. Look right here. This is IIS plus 5, and here's that profile guided optimization plus removing IIS plus .NET 6. And they've gone from spikes into the 40–50% of processor time to their largest spike is at 30%. So they're saying that application efficiency, which is CPU utilization versus requests per second, has gone up 50% by simply moving over to that. So they're using HTTP.sys directly, and they talked about when they were using IIS and .NET Core, and then when they switched over to .NET 6, really early on, and they talk in like really clean detail about why they made those decisions and some of the different things that are on .NET telemetry, and then that opt-in feature, that profile guided optimization, and this is really important. I mentioned this before, but I want to hit it again. It maximizes steady state perf. So like my podcast site already has like sub 20 millisecond response times, and it's very bursty. Podcast comes out, people visit the site, life goes on. But you can see here that they have a very interesting relationship. Everyone kind of logs in and then they log in again. Like they get to work in the morning and they log in. The steady state performance is the thing. They're doing 185 billion requests every day. Profile guided optimization is looking at what's happening, and they're looking at that steady state, and they are making decisions about what they can make faster. And they're doing multiple opt-in environment variables. They're doing the tiered executions, which means it'll run it, see how it worked, and then run it again and do some tests, and then it'll go, this function ran better. We JITted it more effectively, and then it'll swap them out, just like Hot Reload. It'll say, here's a more optimized function. They're doing quick JITs for loop, and they got 10% there. And then they're using this ready for run, which gets the thing started up really quickly, and then they go and do the dynamic profile guided optimization. So you're seeing that they're getting 8, 10, 13%, boom, 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 as they go and turn these different things on. So all of that's kind of like for free when you upgrade to .NET 6, and that's why I think .NET 6 is really well positioned to be what's called an LTS release. It'll be supported for the next 3 years. So .NET 5 is heading out of support. You go over to .NET and hit download. Here's all the places that it runs. And then there's a support thing that'll explain that this will be supported until 2024. And then that's why on my podcast and my personal website at the bottom, I put the version of .NET that I'm currently running. So like as Azure updates the runtime, I can see specifically which version gets updated to. And then on my podcast, I actually did this too, which I'm pretty happy with. I never really trusted my websites, and I was afraid to touch them. So in production right now, I can see the git commit and the build of the code that's running on my current website. So I can click right now. I'll right click and I'll say open link as work, because this is a private repo. And I can see here was 2 days ago, I upgraded from 5 to 6. So like I went from my production website to look at the actual code changes and version changes. So I always feel comfortable that I know what's in production. And then I can click here where it says build, and that will actually take me to the Azure DevOps link and show me the warnings and exactly what happened. And I can click and see the logs for when my application got built. And I've got details on that on my blog here adding a git commit hash and Azure DevOps build number and build ID to an ASP.NET website. And what I recommend that people do, mine's public, so it doesn't really matter, but you could make it so if you're logged in as admin, which public wouldn't see, then you'd go to the bottom and you'd see what the current build that's live is, right? And that's super cool because you might have an accident where you've got 10 machines in the web farm and one doesn't get updated and you're wondering what's going on, like what machine am I on? You can put environmental information at the bottom of your app. So here I can see that on my blog, I'm still on .NET Core 3.1 LTS, but I know exactly when it happened, right? Looks like it happened a year ago. My blog has been very stable. I'll be upgrading it to .NET 6 probably this week because I'm going to go from one LTS build, one long-term support build, to another LTS build because my blog is more important to me to stay stable than the podcast, which I'm more willing to like break and goof around on. Does that make sense? Cool. Any questions, comments? Y'all are very quiet. Hopefully I did not waste your time. Feel free to unmute and say that sucked and then troll me and leave, or you can just say, yeah, that didn't suck, or just leave. That's fine too. It's a good release and I'm happy with it. I think you should check it out. There's a ton more stuff we could talk about, but it's also worth pointing out that it's supported in Azure Functions, Azure Static Web Apps, and Azure App Service today. Blazor is looking really cool. Everyone's loving it. And remember that there's always two choices. You don't have to use WebAssembly. Some people ask me why I don't. Here's a great question here. We got a question from external saying, is Blazor preferred now in development? This is a really important thing to say. Let's talk about that for a brief second. Should I take my podcast site and turn it into Blazor? No, of course not. Absolutely not. It's a website. Why would I do that, right? It's a great website. It works fine. The web gets markdown, or gets markup when you visit a website. I want HTML. If I look at the source for my website, I get divs. If I turn this into a Blazor web app, what do I gain? I gain nothing. Blazor is great for web applications. This is a website. I don't think of this as a web app. So I don't want people to randomly upgrade to Blazor just because it's the new hotness. What I think people should be looking at Blazor for is like, if you've got a line of business app or a web forms app that has a very focused component-based model, yeah, absolutely. Blazor is going to be a great opportunity for web forms people to move into the future. It's also worth pointing out that things like my blog, which was written in web forms, we went and upgraded it to Razor, not Blazor. So like this is just a choice. You have options. MVC still works. Minimal APIs works. Razor pages work. Remember that in ASP.NET, that pipeline, that request pipeline is the same. So all those minimal APIs, I'm like, oh my God, everything changed. And what did Safia show? They moved my cheese. It's the same pipeline. That's why I got confused because I'm, wait a second, this is all new. And Safia's like, no, I just injected where you saw that map fallback to static files. She was just making it so if someone visited / then we would go and serve index.html because there's no reason that the same website couldn't serve both the static Blazor files and the graphics and the CSS and also host the web API. So I know that there's some FUD and some confusion in the community where people are saying, I don't like web APIs. I don't like minimal APIs. Don't use them then. Nothing's changed. MVC works great. Like we didn't change that. That got improvements too. Question here, would you recommend Blazor for public web apps? Yeah, so the great thing about Blazor is that WebAssembly is absolutely out. It's not a cutting edge thing. It's been out for years. But Blazor server doesn't require WebAssembly and works just fine as well. So you've got choices there. I don't want you to think that you have to run everything in WebAssembly in the browser. So I would start with Blazor server if you're like a web forms shop or you've got some application that's like text boxes over data and you're doing a nice line of business app. absolutely. Would I do my brochureware public web app in Blazor? No, I would use Razor. If it's a web application, yeah, use it. You see the difference? Web apps have a lot of input, have a lot of complexity, have a lot of interaction. Like if you're going to write Gmail or Hotmail, yeah, do it in Blazor. If you're going to write, the Department of Motor Vehicles search site, that's kind of a balance. Like how interactive is it? How complicated is it? If it's a couple of text boxes and a button and a search, But if it's a cool interactive map and a bunch of tables, and then maybe think about Blazor. All right. What else we got here? Yeah, see, great example from Jasper. Great option for interactive apps. The site's less dynamic, use Razor, and you can do both, right? Absolutely. Rohit has got an API in .NET 5. Yeah, you can upgrade to .NET 6. It's totally cool. With .NET 6, if you're hosting it in Azure, the nice part is that if you're not doing self-contained, the app service will be upgrading it automatically, so you'll get the .NET 6 security updates for free. This is a good question from Rick saying, is Blazor a rival to Angular and React? I would say no. Angular and React are JavaScript frameworks. Blazor is C# running in the browser. Blazor is for people who don't want to run JavaScript. They don't want to learn it. They don't want to deal with it. So I wouldn't sweat that. EF Core perf improvements related to query generation and execution. Yes, the EF Core team, James Donahue, has a whole blog about the improvements to EF Core in detail. Huge improvements, almost double. Almost double. Cool. All right, I got to go to my next thing, but big thanks to Safia if she's still here for saving the day. Follow her on the Twitter, and there you go. Thank you, Luke, for putting this together. Golf clap.